Hi everyone. This video is going to be about common mistakes people make and their results in discussion section of their IMRD research paper. We're going to start with the results section. This is the part of IMRD where you present the data you got from field research. As a researcher, our goal with presenting data and results is to be first concise. You kind of want to give the spark notes of your data because your reader doesn't want to dig through all your data. Your reader isn't going to sit here and read every single interview transcript or look at every single piece of data from your survey. Instead, they want something that's concise and well presented. The second goal is you want to be clear with the data you present. Your reader should be able to look at the image, like the chart, the visual, or the section and be like, yes, I understand. I know exactly what you're showing me. This is why a lot of times we use graphs, charts, and tables, because that's a lot easier to understand, like, hey, everything's grouped together, it has a clear title, I know what I'm looking at. That's a lot easier to understand than if you're doing it just in text. Our third goal with presenting data is we want our data to be faithful. We don't want it to have any biases or manipulation. This can be the case if you recall before, we had a principles of research video, and that some people have the impression that they have to win research or have the best research, whereas that's not true. All research is valuable. But if some feel that they have to be performative with their data or their data has to be perfect, they might misrepresent that data in order to boost their ego or appear more important than it actually is. And when that happens, it can be misused and have negative consequences. So we do want to be as faithful as possible with our data. So some mistakes and results can be unintentional, though. I'm not going to assume that anyone in this class is intentionally faking their data. So instead, I want to focus on a more common issue, which would be inaccurate descriptions or representations of data. This usually connects to statistics. So if you do a survey, you're probably going to use numbers and statistics. We'll start with why do we like statistics and why do we trust them? As a reader, cognitively speaking, numbers are very easy to compute in our heads. We see like 80%, we're like, that's a B, it's passing, I like it. So in a way, statistics are very easy, and then because they're so easy, we more readily trust them. However, we should kind of resist this instinct to immediately trust a statistic. Instead, we should be asking, what does that statistic actually represent, and what went into making that statistic? To illustrate, I want to focus on an example from my own research. So this is from a study I did about why students procrastinate in writing classes. And my survey found that 71% of students procrastinate on assignments. At first glance, do you like that statistic? Is it something you trust? I think my first impression of it is like, yes, like 71% sounds accurate. Like, I procrastinate, I know students procrastinate. 71% seems like an accurate number. However, we need to keep asking, what does that 71% actually represent? And how did I get that 71%? So, if we ask those questions, it would reveal something first, that my survey actually only had 7 participants. So 5 of the 7 students who I surveyed said they procrastinated. Do you feel better about that statistic, or do you start doubting it? Would you want to take what 5 people said and generalize it to an entire population? So the statistic's not as nice as it used to be. Another complication is that the students I surveyed, or the students who took my survey, were all graduate level students, so in their doctorate or master's program. Well, I'm pretty sure when you saw that 71% of students, you were not thinking about grad students, you were thinking about undergrads. So you've definitely been misled to some degree. And then lastly, everyone who took my survey was a white man. This complicates things because I'm pretty sure we don't want to base decisions purely on what 5 white men say. I'm sure that women experience things differently or procrastinate for different reasons. Same with minorities. They have different experiences that would impact how they procrastinate or behave. So overall, we're realizing that this statistic is not accurately representing what it is. To address this concern of, well, this wasn't an accurate representation of the information, your first step is to make sure you have a large enough population size. So we're going to strive for 50 people to take our survey, but 20 people is a good amount in order to generalize something. So strive for 20 participants. Additionally, you need to account for how your results are based on demographics, so gender, age, and race. If you don't have even distribution, such as like 50% women, 50% men, or having a variety of races, it's okay. You don't have to toss your data. You just have to account for it. So first, describe it in the methods section. There's a specific sub-area called participants. This is where you would say, like, oh, of my survey, it was 7 white men who were in graduate school. So you are just very honest about who actually took your survey. You also address it in the limitations. So you should say, my survey didn't have a large reach. Here's how I would do it differently. You should also adjust the claims you're making to a specific group. So instead of saying 71% of students, you should specify who you actually mean. Additionally, a good strategy is to use the raw numbers instead of automatically converting to a percentage. That way it has more accuracy. So to solve the issue of 71% of students procrastinate on assignments, it now can become 5 of the 7 white male graduate students say they procrastinate on assignments. It's a much more accurate take. Another mistake we should briefly talk about is correlation versus causation. So you might have heard these terms. Let's dive a little bit deeper into them though. Causation is the idea that X variable causes Y outcome, whereas correlation is the idea that X variable influences the outcome of Y. For example, people might claim that soup causes cancer. It sounds outrageous, right? It can't be possible. The reason it's not possible is because our body has too many variables. There's too many things going on in our body for soup to be the one thing that causes cancer. Instead, there might be a correlation, the idea that soup influences the outcome or the probability of cancer. So it'd be more accurate to say people who eat lots of processed soups are more likely or more at risk to get cancer. You can't say causes. Causation is extremely hard to prove in research, so most researchers avoid it and they stick just to correlation studies or suggested correlations. We're also very humble people, so we would only say causation if we had plenty of data. If we do find something is correlated, we also have to ask ourselves if it's reasonable or significant. So if you do like research in the future, you probably will learn more advanced statistics to tackle this. But for now, we can just ask ourselves those questions. Is it reasonable? Is it significant? For example, here's an illustration of where the number of people who drowned by falling in a pool seems to be correlated with films Nicolas Cage appeared in. That's because the two lines seem to overlap. We know automatically this isn't causation because impossible for that factor to affect it. There's just too many variables. For correlation, you would think, oh yeah, it's correlated because the two lines overlap at points. But we know that one, it's not reasonable. It's not reasonable for these two variables to be connected in some way. And second, it's not significant, like the extreme amounts of drownings. It'd be different if there was like millions or something like that. So we know we have to be very cautious about the claims we're making with charts and the presentation of charts. All this focused on data in the results section, but we also should talk about discussion, which is the section after results that analyzes your data, makes connections, and assesses it. One mistake people make with the discussion section is by having faulty assumptions. This is when you believe the reader already has certain knowledge or thoughts about the topic, so you feel like, oh, I never really have to address that. I just am assuming they know. For example, you might assume readers have certain background knowledge, they have similar experiences to you or similar values, that they're really familiar with terms, they have the same goal as you or are on the same side, or that they're just familiar with the evidence, like keeping in mind that you've done a vast amount of research. Your reader probably hasn't done that. Because we assume these things, we never clarify, define, or address certain topics in our paper. The problem with that is that our reader can make a faulty connection because they're missing important information, or the reader will lose interest because they are confused and they don't understand and they're like, it's way above me, I'm not even going to read it. We want people to read and enjoy and follow our research, so we need to do better. another thing I wrote here was that from like some study that faulty assumptions are the most common reason why an argument falls apart, and it's the most common mistake that students make. So it's especially so that we should pay attention to this. To fix faulty assumptions, first you should define key terms and key concepts. So if you are introducing a certain topic, it might help to take a moment in the lit review or introduction to say, hey, this is how we're defining it. For example, you might want to define what you mean by woman, or what you mean by correct or morally right. The second thing is you need to explain evidence and reasoning with detail. So it's not enough just to be like, here's evidence. You need to make sure you break down that evidence and make it clear to the reader what they should take away and what they should believe. Lastly, you need to anticipate the possible misinterpretations or confusions. This is why it's important to meet with people and talk with people and get feedback. When you do that, you can get a better scope of what people know and what people don't know. You can also get a better scope of what people might disagree with, so you can better adapt your paper to address those concerns. The last mistake I want to talk about is logical fallacies, which I'm sure you've covered a ton of times before in like 103 or in your high school career. For our purposes in this class, fallacies can be broken out into two categories and have two types of fixes. The first category of fallacy is insufficiency. This is a fallacy that deals with not having evidence. You simply are making arguments and not having any support for them. An example would be an overgeneralization. To fix fallacies of insufficiency, you need to modify your language to make sure it's focused on quality and accuracy. So this could be a weaker verb. So instead of saying like it concludes or argues, you can say maybe it seems or suggests. You should have a more precise subject, such as the white male grad students. You can pay attention to your modifiers to make sure they're kind of scaled back. I also suggest using phrases like this research or this study so that you can put it in the scope of what your field research does rather than making a huge claim. With this, students, their strategy usually is to they usually try to modify their language by adding statements like I think or I believe. And I want you to avoid that because that's really lessening the impact of your work. You still did research and gathered evidence and have the data to make arguments. You can still make claims. You just have to make more precise claims. The last set of fallacies deals with relevancy, or the type is called relevance. And this is when you have evidence, but you have no reasoning, connections, or analysis. You're just dropping in information and say, yep, I'm right. Can't do that. The example I have is correlation versus causation, which we looked at with like Nicolas Cage. There's evidence, but we know it's not right or explained. To fix issues of relevancy, you should address the sample size, so making sure you have enough participants. You should consider all variables, such as things you didn't account for, or like variables that you didn't consider till after people took the survey. Lastly, you need to fully develop your arguments. Next week, we're going to talk about argument structure and how to make sure they're fully developed. But for now, just keep in mind that you should always be explaining your evidence. You can't assume the evidence is enough. To end, these mistakes that I've covered, they can be intentional, but sometimes they're just unintentional. Like you're just writing real fast, or even you believed it and had that faulty assumption. It happens. We just need to make sure then that we engage with a peer review process and that people are holding us accountable. If we don't get feedback, we risk hurting our credibility and logic. People aren't going to enjoy or believe our piece, and then that becomes a reflection of you. We also need to check our fallacies and biases so we don't mislead our audience. Again, data can be used against people. It can determine laws, policies, it can determine medical programs. So we don't want to include inaccurate data. We also need to maintain the image of our fields. We're going into respectful, degree-oriented fields. So we want to kind of honor the hard work of that. And then lastly, we want to produce something of value and impact. The more authentic and honest we are, the more trusted we are. And then people want to read our pieces and they actually want to use that data because they know they can trust it.